Hi there, I'm Alex, a postgraduate researcher in creative writing and lit studies, and what you see before you is a recorded version of a presentation that I gave at the Australasian Association of Writing Programs conference in 2018. This was received pretty well on the day, and I'm a little bit proud of it myself, so I thought that I would make a version of it that was accessible to those who couldn't be there on the day, those outside the field, and those who are just interested. Obviously, this was originally brought into the world in an academic context, but I've generally tried to keep it as low on jargon as possible, so a background in that area isn't required to enjoy this. And even people who do have an academic background get sick of jargon from time to time, so we're all on the same page there. Please bear with me, I'm recording this with a tiny bit of a sore throat, because Murphy's Law dictates that would happen on the day I decide to record. But without further ado, let's talk about the ways that interactive narrative can let us play with tropes. So the key focus of my research is the concept of narrative play, of taking tropes and genre conventions that audiences are familiar with and tweaking or subverting them somehow within the narrative in the name of social commentary. Principally, my analysis and creative practice has dealt with this in the realm of novels, but today I'd like to invite you all along on an exploration of how a different type of media can give us the opportunity to play with tropes, namely interactive media, in this case narrative-driven video games. In this paper, I'll be discussing two cinematic, choice-based, narrative-driven games, Supermassive's Until Dawn and Don't Nod's Life is Strange, and how they each draw on familiar tropes and historical genre conventions, and how they present the player the opportunity to, appropriately enough, play with these conventions and tell stories that subvert them, or not, depending on their choices. At the risk of perhaps stating the obvious, but it ought to be said, quote, the biggest difference between a traditional story and an interactive narrative is the added element of participant agency. In an interactive story like the games we'll be examining today, the person engaging with the text is not just an audience member observing a piece of media, but is part of a collaborative effort to create the story. Indeed, both of my examples place emphasis on the power of the player's choices. Both are firmly in the realm of what Marie-Laure Ryan would call a playable story, a game, quote, in which the production of an aesthetically rewarding story is a goal in itself, rather than simply being games where, quote, the player pursues a specific goal in association with winning. The creation of a story unique to your particular playthrough is essentially the goal of these games, and in both there is repeated emphasis that the player's decisions throughout the game will impact the way this story unfolds, in both large ways and small. Both make use of the motif of the butterfly effect to get this across, a hypothetical scientific concept that has been, quote, embraced by popular culture, where the term is often used to emphasize the outsized significance of minute occurrence. A visual motif of butterflies follows the player throughout both Until Dawn and Life is Strange, to drive home this idea that the player's choices are shaping the narrative, no matter how small those choices may be. With a malleable, collaborative story like this, a perhaps unique opportunity for playing with familiar tropes and genre conventions presents itself, and one that reveals the subversive and progressive potential of the medium. These are two games that draw heavily on familiar tropes and simultaneously give the player a heavy degree of participation in the construction of their narratives. Thus, the player as storyteller is given a unique opportunity to recognize the narrative and character tropes in front of them, and, should they wish, divert the narrative away from cliché or historically harmful convention with the choices they make. In the interactive horror movie that is Until Dawn, the player as storyteller can work to avoid the deaths of women and minority characters, subverting tropes that would be set in stone in a static piece of media, like the films the game is drawing inspiration from. In Life is Strange, when faced with the tragic death of a queer character, which is so often predetermined by historical narrative convention, the player as storyteller can instead choose for that queer character to live, and defy that harmful archetype. Or, the player as storyteller can make choices that play directly into these tropes and clichés as they present themselves, if that's what they decide. To examine this method of player agency and the subversion of problematic tropes, let's first look at Life is Strange. Life is Strange is the supernatural-tinged coming-of-age story of Max Caulfield, a teenage girl who moves back to her hometown Arcadia Bay to study. Max discovers one day that she has the ability to rewind time. Puberty's weird like that. And she first uses her powers to save her estranged childhood friend Chloe from being shot during a fight with another student. Max and Chloe reunite and attempt to reconcile their issues, as well as try to work out exactly what Max's sudden superpowers mean and how best to use them. The player is also given the opportunity across the game to bring Max and Chloe together as a romantic pair rather than close friends. Even if the player's storyteller keeps this relationship platonic, of course, it's still very evident in the text that Chloe is a woman who likes other women. Life is Strange gained a loyal and vocal fan following for its positive portrayal of a queer romance and its portrayal of Max and Chloe as queer protagonists. A fan following that was shocked and disappointed when the ending of this fresh and positive game invoked a historical and problematic trope regarding queer characters and death. The trope in question is colloquially known as bury your gays. Kira Deshler writes, in her appropriately titled thesis, Not Another Dead Lesbian, that for many years, queerness as portrayed in fantasy and as the lived experience of individuals has been linked to death. This link comes from, as well as historical homophobia obviously, specific aspects of media history. Throughout the 20th century, it was routine practice for publishing houses to refuse to print novels with queer themes or characters unless they had an unhappy ending, lest they be seen as quote-unquote encouraging deviant behaviour. This led to swathes of fictional LGBTQIA plus people renouncing their queerness, going insane, or most commonly dying by the end of their story. The ultimate combination, sometimes one half of a queer couple would end the story in a straight relationship, and the other would commit suicide or otherwise accept their doom and live their life alone and miserable. Due to production limitations such as the Hays Code, this was also persistent in mainstream film, with queer film historian Vito Russo describing mid-20th century Hollywood as a kill 'em or cure 'em climate. These days we're living in a very different social climate, and contemporary media is making slow strides in defiance from this narrative. But, to quote Heather Love, the association of homosexuality with loss, melancholia, and failure runs deep. These historically established tropes are still entrenched in a lot of media, and tragedy hangs over many queer fictional characters to this day. It's this deep-running association with queerness and tragedy that makes the final player choice of Life is Strange's interactive story so troublesome, and yet at the same time, depending on the player's choices, potentially subversive. What happens is, over the course of the game, increasingly bizarre natural phenomena begin to occur, culminating in a disastrous storm that threatens to wipe out Arcadia Bay. The characters come to the conclusion that the strange events are the direct result of Max meddling with the flow of time. Max, and through her the player storyteller, is faced with two final options. She can either go back in time and let Chloe get shot, thus never altering the future, or she can refuse to sacrifice Chloe and instead let the storm destroy their home. It's an appropriately climactic and shocking ethical choice of the trolley problem family. It's a choice that creates two different endings. To borrow from Sean Grose's plot summary and analysis, in the ending where Chloe dies, quote, the butterfly lands on Chloe's casket, Max knows she's done the right thing, unquote. Whereas in the ending where Chloe lives, quote, Max looks sadly at her town that is no more and seems to look as though she worries if she made the wrong choice. As you can perhaps tell from Grose's wording there, many players felt that the ending where Chloe dies, the ending with the more utilitarian perspective, and also the ending that invokes bury your gays, was meant to be the quote-unquote correct ending. I would argue that, given the emphasis on creating a unique story rather than winning or getting a true ending, as in Ryan's definitions, there is no ending to the game that is wholly positive or wholly negative, which is a crucial part of the strenuous ethical choice at the game's climax. However, most importantly, this was a matter of choice, and that participant agency that we talked about before. Marley-Ann Butt and Daniel Dunne have observed that for many players, saving Chloe became something of an act of rebellion, and, quote, rather than following what was presumed as the right choice, they could instead claim what was meant to be an alternate ending as their own, thus performing the very autonomy that Life is Strange was attempting to question. Choosing for Chloe to live is in many ways an open defiance not just of Chloe's supposed tragic fate within the story, but an open defiance of a long history of buried gays in storytelling overall. The player is presented with the choice to adhere to this old and problematic trope, and they can thus choose to subvert it. Of course, the town still gets destroyed, and the briefness of that ending does leave the implication that literally everyone apart from Chloe and Max is dead. So the association between queerness and tragedy is still clinging to the story with skeletal little hands. However, the player is still granted the power to avoid at least some of the historical and negative narrative associations that overshadow the ending of the story, and create a happy, if bittersweet, ending to Max and Chloe if they wish, the kind of ending that would be denied them in a static piece of media. There's a similar, imperfect though interesting, process of narrative play to be found in Until Dawn. Until Dawn tells the story of 8 characters in their late teens who travel to a secluded mountain cabin for a holiday weekend. If the player has any familiarity with the tropes of horror, they already know that nothing good can come of this. And sure enough, the teenagers soon find themselves fighting for their lives as murderous threats come at them from all sides. Across its narrative, various threats are revealed and then debunked. The game shifts from a haunting movie to a slasher movie to a monster movie, with even a touch of the revenge movie, if you take the perspective of the monster. Changing scenario allows it to run the gamut of horror tropes from a variety of subgenres, and it's with these tropes that the story invites you to play. Despite that opening imagery of the diverging paths and the butterfly effect, Until Dawn's a fairly linear narrative, and then tends to follow essentially the same plot beats every playthrough and leads up to the same conclusion. The main aspect of the story the player's choices can influence is which characters live and which characters die. Anywhere between 8 and 0 members of the main cast can survive this ordeal, depending on the player's choices and actions throughout the game. And here the game runs into, and presents the opportunity to mess around with, tropes regarding character death, much like Life is Strange does. For this, let's focus on the final girl, which is a term coined by Carol J. Clover in her book Men, Women, and Chainsaws. As her name suggests, the final girl is the sole character, always female, who survives until the end of the movie, often thwarting the monster or chainsaw-wielding killer as well. The final girl is the most sympathetic character who represents the universal fears of the audience. In Clover's words, she is introduced in the beginning and is the only character to be developed in any psychological detail. She is intelligent, watchful, level-headed. But not just anyone could be a final girl. As Clover states, the practice viewer distinguishes her from her friends minutes into the film. She is the Girl Scout, the bookworm, and the mechanic, and unlike her girlfriends, she is not sexually active. A genre-savvy player will recognize the character Sam as the final girl of Until Dawn, from her sympathetic nature to her being the first point-of-view character outside of the prologue, to her lack of romantic and or sexual interest in any of the other characters, to her use of a boyish nickname, etc. These are all traits of the story's destined sole survivor, according to Clover. However, there is the added complication in this case that Until Dawn is not a static piece of media like film, but an interactive one. So Sam's survival is not necessarily guaranteed, despite the usual rules of cinema, and this is where that subversive element kind of comes into play. The final girl is not necessarily a problematic trope on its own. In fact, in many ways, the presence of a capable female protagonist who defeats evil is quite empowering, as Clover herself examines across the book. Issues arise in the tropes that lie adjacent to it. After all, to be the sole survivor, other characters need to die, and this is where infamous and troublesome archetypes begin to rear their heads. The clearest example is that assertion of Clover's that, unlike her girlfriends, the final girl is not sexually active. James B. Twitchell also wrote about this subtextual, or perhaps not so subtextual, aspect of the slasher genre, noting that, quote, in most stab-it female movies, the victim has been sexually liberated, read promiscuous, and therefore should be, quote-unquote, punished. This comes into play in Until Dawn when a couple, Jess and Mike, travel to a secluded cabin boasting about their intentions to sleep together for the first time. But before they can even get fully undressed, the monster attacks and captures Jess, dragging her through the forest. However, Jess does not have to die in this scene. Playing as Mike as he chases after the monster, the player must navigate a series of challenges that, if done quickly enough, can lead to Mike reaching Jess before she gets killed. Jess will then drop down into a mine shaft, and the narrative will return to her later in the game, giving the player the opportunity to pilot her safely out of the tunnels. So with the right player actions, Jess can defy her usually predetermined place on the horror movie hit list. And the same goes for the racial minority characters, Emily and Matt. The element of choice provides the ability to save these characters from the death tropes they normally inhabit, be that sex equals death, or the black guy dies first, or any other variation. That said, it isn't always that simple, and the construction of the game's story does impose limits to the player or storyteller's manipulation of these tropes. For instance, while there are many opportunities to save other characters throughout the game, it does still lean towards installing Sam as the final girl. For one thing, Sam can't die until the final scene, which all the other characters, with the exception of the heroic Mike, have multiple opportunities for choice-induced death throughout the story. So up to a certain point, Sam is thus indestructible, which does make the other characters, the sexually interested girl, the non-white characters, appear all the more disposable. The player can still revoke Sam's final girl status by not having her be the only survivor of the story, or by having Sam herself die while, for example, Jess and Emily and Matt defy their tropes and live to tell the tale. For some players, storytellers, of course, it simply may not feel subversive or feminist to let an innocent female character get murdered by a monster on screen. And in the end, though the player has some impact on which characters live and die, there are still many troublesome horror tropes they can't interact with, such as the game's treatment of mental health, or its adherence to some sexist tropes which mirror the genre rather than trying to progress it. Until Dawn is an imperfect example of an interactive narrative that allows its player storyteller to play with familiar tropes, but it remains an example nonetheless. If the player wants, they can claim control over at least some notable aspects of the story and of the genre, making it malleable and making it theirs, and potentially telling a story that subverts expectations and harmful story stereotypes in the process. Both Until Dawn and Life is Strange exist as sort of narrative Schrodinger's cats. Until the player makes a choice, they are simultaneously stories that play into historically entrenched sexist, homophobic tropes, and stories that subvert historically entrenched sexist, homophobic tropes. And neither of these results can be considered more canon than the other. It's a conundrum unique to interactive storytelling and branching narrative. Of course, ideally these works would simply avoid the use of these old tropes altogether, but they're providing the audience the opportunity to disrupt these tropes in motion does present a fascinating avenue for analysis, both in feminism and queer studies as well as narrative construction generally. Players can find a sense of personal rebellion against long-held media hang-ups by defying fate to save Chloe, and players can equally commit personal rebellions against the misogynistic, sex-negative, and racist tropes of horror by manipulating them through their choices and creating a horror narrative of their own in Until Dawn. From whatever direction the player's storyteller approaches these games, these two examples demonstrate how playable narratives can let us play with narrative in new and interesting ways. And that wraps us up for that presentation. Thank you for listening. I'm not going to tell you to like and subscribe because I don't really have a YouTube presence, but it is a very handy platform for sharing this sort of thing as an easy video hyperlink. If you want more content like this from me, you can go to my academia.edu site, or for a less sort of formal side of things, you can go to my blog for more explorations and essays on pop culture and tropes and the like. I'll link both of those in the description as well as my citations if you're interested in any further reading. Hope you enjoyed this, hope you learned something or just found it interesting. Take care out there, and thank you again for stopping by.